Hello and welcome to my secret synth stash with me, Woody. I've shown you all of this before. Just a quick recap. We've got a whole bunch of hardware synths here. The bass station, there's a mini-log, another mini-log out there. Wave state, we have a Native Instruments thingammy-jigamy machine here. MIDI keyboards, about 6 boutiques. There's another one there. Akai MPC. Well, Microfreak, yeah, it goes on and on. Believe it or not, it might not seem much. There is some more stuff out there as well, but altogether, all of this has cost me $6,000. You don't really notice when you're buying all these small ticket items. I mean, this SEO2 was maybe 400 bucks. But when you buy 10 of these things, 15 of these things, it really starts adding up. Death by 1,000 cuts. Someone said in the comments that's $6,000 of junk, which I think was a little bit harsh. And if I had bought this new, I bought a lot of this used, I would have been looking more like $10,000. And it struck me that for the same money, actually a lot less, I could have bought a brand new Yamaha Montage workstation, or even a Yamaha Genos, or a Nautilus and a Roland Phantom for less than the cost of all of this stuff. So why would you choose to buy lots of bits and bobs like this, and when should you perhaps choose to buy a workstation instead? Come to think of it, I'm pretty convinced that this, the little Machine Plus, can do pretty much most of what all of these other synths can do combined. So why might you want to buy a whole bunch of synths and drum machines like this here or this here, when you could just get a single synth to rule them all, a mighty synth workstation like the Montage, for example? And this is something I've been giving a lot of thought as I've been trying out these two different approaches, so I'll share with you the conclusions I've reached so far, and I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments. So what's the goal of a setup like this then? Often we just want to get down ideas very quickly, a creative process, a good workflow where we can quickly come up with beats, ideas, perhaps even a full song, and just have a lot of fun performing and playing our own ideas. You might also want to take your rig out and perform in front of an audience, which is very cool, but I think today we'll focus mainly on the studio applications of these kind of setups. Let's talk about the drawbacks that I've ran into so far. Well, obviously it's a lot more expensive, as we just touched on. Surprisingly so, you don't really notice how quickly it adds up, and you need to factor into that as well all the cables, adapters, dongles. You'll need MIDI splitters, MIDI mergers, you'll need audio interfaces, you'll need mixers, you'll probably need external effects as well. All of these things combined can quickly add up. I mean, it's a lot of fun as well, of course, not just about the money. I've noticed it's a lot more clutter. A single workstation or two can be stored in their case, and it doesn't take up much space, but all of these little individual synths, groove boxes, drum machines, wow, they do take up a lot of space. It's quite a lot of clutter. And that's just in storage. Once you get them out, if you want to have them all available and ready to play, then it's going to take up a lot more space. You're going to need a big synth rack or a table, a huge desk where you can lay all this stuff out, and various stands and accessories so you can tier them up so they're easily available to you as you play and perform. I don't really have the luxury of doing that, so my synths are stored away in the secret storage facility until I want to play them. Then I drag them out, connect them all up, and that's a bit of a pain, to be honest. I don't really find myself doing it for my own enjoyment. The only time I drag them out, connect them up, is when I want to make a video. So that is a bit of a hurdle to creativity, I think, having to drag them out and connect them all up. As I've mentioned before, you'll need lots of extra outboard gear as well. The synth and the drum machines is not enough. I've quickly discovered the sound of some of these synths, like the monologue that I'm looking at over there. It's just a mono output, no effects. So you need to treat that really. You can get a mixer with some effects, but a lot of times you'll be wanting to buy external effects processors, effects pedals perhaps. So yeah, you need to factor that as well into the cost and the clutter. And of course, all of the cables and the dongles and the MIDI adapters that you'll probably need as well, all need to be bought and stored and used. One thing that I quickly ran into is that connecting all of these devices together and getting them to interface and talk to each other is a real technical challenge. Wow! I've discovered that when connecting these instruments together, like a drum machine and a synth, you want to have the arpeggiators and the sequencers running in time with each other on MIDI clocks, but setting all that stuff up can be a real headache. You'd think it would just work, but no, whenever I need to connect a handful of devices together, I'll spend a couple of hours troubleshooting and figuring out how to get them to work effectively with each other. So I'm finding, for every minute I make making music, there's 10 minutes spent with technical difficulties. Yeah, it's really true. It's also pretty complicated to learn all of this stuff. I can just about learn how to use one synthesizer, maybe one drum machine, and you could have a DAWLESS, this is a computerless jamming setup with just a drum machine and a little synth. That works pretty well actually, but I find it's more interesting when you add a few more things to the mixes, and I've seen some of your DAWLESS setups on YouTube and you have lots of different gear. I don't understand how you can remember how to operate all of that stuff. I certainly can't. I can just about know and remember how to use a drum machine and a synth, but then if I switch to any other gear and then come back to the synth that I just learned earlier, I've completely forgotten how to use it and basically have to start all over again. It's different operating systems, different parameters, different menus and so on, and I'm completely lost the first time I return to an old piece of gear. But that's just me. Another disadvantage with these kind of, I call them, it's not Eurorack or modular synths, but I call them modular setups where you have lots of different synths. If you set up a nice performance scene where you have nice sounds from all the different various instruments, it's not possible to store that as a kind of global preset or a performance as you might do on an arranger keyboard or a workstation synth. So yes, it's going to be much more difficult to recall your settings if you want to perhaps perform live. Yeah, talking about live, of course, it's going to be much more of a PITA to lug around a handful of synthesizers and all of the cables and the devices you need to hook them together. A lot more difficult and challenging and time consuming than just lugging your Phantom to the gig, for example. So I've listed a number of drawbacks, but there must be some benefits because these kind of, I say modular, rigs are pretty popular for DAWLESS jamming. I've seen many of your YouTube videos where you have a setup like this. So why are they so popular? I've got a few ideas. Firstly, I think it's about being able to use the best tool for the job. You can swap in and out different components to get exactly the sound you want. Perhaps there's a drum computer like this that is the absolute best way to do drums. For sure, you get some drum sounds in a workstation synth or an arranger, but you don't get these hands-on controls. This is fabulous for making adjustments during a performance. The same thing applies to this, a synth like the Minilog. You've got tons of hand-on controls for really interesting dynamic performances, and you can mix and match and swap in and out things. You might have a synth that you think is great for bass lines, like my Novation bass station is superb for that. You can match that up with the drum computer of your choice. Why am I saying drum computer? Isn't it drum machine? So it's all about the best tool for the job and not a workstation which is like a Swiss Army knife of generic features and sounds. To be a little bit harsh, I'm sorry. It's also easier to swap in and out or replace or upgrade parts of your musical palette, if you can say it that way. Perhaps a new monosynth comes out that you think would be better for bass lines. Well, you can keep everything else in your setup but just introduce the new synth. It's a lot more flexible, of course, by combining these synths and drum machines with whatever effects units you like, effects pedals and so on. You can create the sound of your dreams, the sound that you have in your imagination, instead of serving up whatever preset you have on a workstation. Yes, you can create your own sounds, I think, on a workstation, of course, but it's probably more limited than what you can do by combining different pieces of hardware gear. Let's be honest, there's a lot of enjoyment and fun to be had just from owning a whole bunch of synths and drum machines. I totally get that. So perhaps it's just basically more fun to have a lot of stuff. I just came up with another benefit as well. By combining gear that you yourselves have picked, it becomes unique. That's your sound, that's your choice of instruments, that's your brushes. You make the music that you want, that you have in your mind, whereas if I'm just playing sounds on a montage, I'll sound like every other guy playing sounds on a montage. Yeah, I think that's probably quite an important one. The setup can be uniquely you, your sound, your music. Yeah, that's pretty cool and important. Perhaps one thing more to mention, some of you are probably screaming at your PC right now. If you get little units like this one, I'll be back in just a second. Actually, the one I had nearby would have done it as well. Something like this is actually analog, and that might be important to some of you. If I get a workstation synth, then I can't think of any example when it's not digital. So a workstation synth is fully digital, whereas here you're getting real voltage controlled oscillators. And yes, I get it. That might be important for some of you. Just a few key points I wanted to mention about Arranger keyboards and workstation synthesizers. They have a vast array of sounds, from analog emulations all the way to acoustic sounds, grand pianos, guitars, and saxophones. And that's sounds you might want to have in your palette. So that's actually a big plus for the workstation synths, because you don't really get those kind of sounds on little units like this. Another thing about arrangers and workstations, they are nearly always multi-timbral, meaning you can play lots of sounds at the same time, usually 16 different sounds. Just imagine what that DAWLESS setup would look like. And once you have all of these 16 sounds set up, your sequencer, arpeggiators, and so on, all the effects, you just press a button and store that as a preset for instant recall if you're performing live or just want to play it again in the future. Yeah, I mentioned effects. All the effects you could possibly want are there on board and available to you without you needing to buy any effects pedals, although they're probably a little bit more generic than your dedicated guitar effects. A drawback of the workstations is pretty limited controls. You might get 8 faders and 8 knobs and a few buttons, but that's about it. You can't really compare it to something like this, which is just for the drums. And of course, very easy to transport, rugged and built for the road. You put your montage in a flight case and you're good to go anywhere in the world. So that's the list of pros and cons that I can think of. There are probably many more, so do let us know down in the comments section. Now then, you might be curious, perhaps, what my personal preferences are. I think I'm leaning towards being more of a workstation guy. I just like the neat and tidy aspect of it, having everything built into one device. Yeah, I like that. I'm just looking over there right now. I've got a couple of synths, a groove box, and a whole mess of cables on the floor, and that just bugs me just a little bit. I've also found that dragging them all out of storage and connecting them up, all the wires, the cabling and the MIDI cables and so on, the mixers, is just a complete pain. So not something I do for fun, but I will do it in order to make the videos. And I was also surprised how costly it quickly got when you started buying all of these individual devices. Now, of course, you don't need to buy as much stuff as I did. It was kind of ridiculous, but I do need interesting gear to feature here on the channel. The stuff that I bought used, I can sell on without losing too much money on it, hopefully. So I think of it as free rental, which is pretty cool. But you don't need to go necessarily full-blown montage or phantom. I got excellent results in the past with little synths, budget synths like the JD-XI from Roland. That was fabulous, the Korg Electribe. I made some amazing tracks with that, well, in my opinion, and had a lot of fun with them anyway. So that's another option, some middle ground. You don't necessarily have to get flagship workstation or a DAWLESS jamming setup. There are middle ground as well that's worth exploring. And of course, there is a third approach that we'll mention now, but I won't dig into it. I've covered it in separate videos. I could, of course, just get a MIDI controller and install on my PC some UHI plugins, Native Instruments Complete, the Roland Cloud, and then I've got access to all of those sounds in the box on my PC, no clutter at all, and probably a lot cheaper than the hardware equivalents. And on that bombshell, let's wrap this one up. Thank you ever so much for watching. I'll see you again soon with reviews and demos of workstation synths and small little compact synths, just like this one. I'll see you then. Cheerio.